My ex-wife, who left me for taking care of my sick dad, is trying to get me back with her friend's help. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm Ben. I'm 38, and until recently, I thought my life was pretty under control. You know, typical stuff: a house, a job, an ex-wife, and a dad I was really close to. My ex Lisa and I have been split up for a bit now, but let me tell you, she's always been a piece of work. Anyway, this all started with my dad. He was my rock. He'd been struggling with kidney disease and heart failure for the past year. It's been rough. I've been driving him to the clinic 3 times a week for dialysis treatments. That's what was keeping him alive, but it was like walking on thin ice. You know, every time we went, I wondered if it would be his last. Lisa never understood. Actually, understood is too nice a word. She just didn't care. I didn't care. We'd been together for years, but she was always self-centered. The more my dad got sick, the more she started acting out. She hated that I was spending so much time with him. She'd say things like, "Why can't you just let him deal with it himself? You're always running off to take care of him." She made it sound like I was ditching her to go to the bar with the guys or something. It wasn't like that. My dad needed me, and I wasn't going to ignore him just because Lisa wanted me to notice her new hair color or some other thing she did to get my attention. I'm not saying I was the perfect husband, but I was trying to focus on my dad's needs when I was worried about whether he was going to make it. The worst part was that Lisa didn't even try to pretend she cared about him. When I got home from a long day with my dad, Lisa would be waiting for me at the door, arms crossed, looking like she was about to explode. "Where have you been?" she'd snap. "You know you promised to help me with dinner tonight." I'd tell her the same thing every time I was at the clinic with my dad. Lisa didn't care. She'd just roll her eyes and I'd walk away, muttering under my breath. This went on for months. I was taking care of my dad, and she was getting more and more angry that I wasn't around to cater to her every need. It got to the point where I dreaded coming home. I loved my dad, but every time I dropped him off after dialysis, I'd sit in my car for a minute and think, do I really have to go home to this? It wasn't just about me helping my dad. Lisa was obsessed with money. She was constantly bringing up how we didn't have enough and how we needed to buy a new car. She'd always be going on and on about how we didn't have enough money, how we needed to buy a new car, how she wanted to go on fancy vacations like her friends. The thing is, I was already stressed out about Bill. We weren't doing great financially, but I didn't want to bother my dad about it. He'd worked his whole life for his money, and he deserved to use it on himself, not on bailing me out of my own financial problems. But Lisa didn't see it that way. She'd say things like, "Your dad's sitting on all this cash, and here we are barely scraping by. Why won't you just ask him for help?" I'd shut that down real quick. "I'm not asking my dying father for money, Lisa. If you want to live in a mansion, maybe you should go marry someone else." That usually shut her up, but not for long. One day, things hit a breaking point. I'd just gotten back from spending the entire day with my dad. At the clinic, he was having a rough time, and I didn't even know if he'd make it home when I finally walked through the front door. Lisa was waiting for me, leaning against the hallway wall with that same annoyed look on her face. "Ben, we need to talk," she said, like she hadn't already been yelling at me every day for the past year. I sighed and asked what it was this time. "Lisa, I knew I was in for it, but I didn't expect what came next." She crossed her arms and said, "When are we going to get a new car? All my friends are driving new cars, and here we are in that old piece of junk. And don't even get me started on the house. It's embarrassing." I was speechless. I was stressed out about my dad's health, and she was worried about keeping up with her friends. I lost it. "Are you serious? Right now, my dad's dying, and Lisa is dying, and all you care about is I couldn't believe it." She didn't even flinch. She just shrugged and said, "Well, if he's so rich, why isn't he helping you out? You're his son. He can't take it with him when he goes. You know that." That was it. That was the moment I knew we were done. I couldn't be with someone that heartless. I walked straight past her into our bedroom and grabbed her suitcase from the closet. I didn't care if it was late or if she didn't have anywhere to go. I wasn't spending another night in the same house as her. I threw the suitcase on the bed and said, "Pack your things, Lisa. You're leaving tonight." At first, she laughed like she thought I was joking. But when she saw the look on my face, she realized I was serious. She freaked out, started yelling about how I couldn't kick her out, and said half of everything was hers. Blah, blah, blah. I didn't care. I was done. I told her she could leave, but not another night. She stormed out, but not before calling her family. Before I knew it, her parents and brother were banging on the door demanding I let them in so they could help her pack. They tore through the house like they owned the place, grabbing anything they thought Lisa should take. By the time they left, the house was a mess. I didn't care though. I was just relieved she was finally gone. That night, I sat in my empty house surrounded by as I looked around at the mess they'd left behind. I felt a weird sense of relief. My dad was dying, my marriage was over, and I had no idea what the future held. But at least one thing was clear. I wasn't going to waste another minute on someone who didn't care about what really mattered. So, a few weeks after I kicked Lisa out, things were finally starting to settle down, or at least I thought they were. I was still trying to get my head straight after everything that had happened. I was also dealing with my dad's declining health. We both knew he was nearing the end of his life. I was trying to prepare myself, but I don't think you ever truly can. I got divorced from Lisa, and I thought that was the end of it. One day, my dad's lawyer showed up at my house. At first, I thought maybe something had happened to my dad. The lawyer he was just there to talk about arrangements for when the time came, funeral stuff, wills, that kind of thing. It was a hard conversation to have, but I was glad we were getting ahead of it. He sat me down and started going over the paperwork. That's when he told me, "Ben, your father left everything to you." I knew my dad had some money, but I didn't realize just how much until that moment. The guy had saved up a pretty hefty amount over the years. I never asked him for it. I had no idea. Even when Lisa was pushing me to take it, I didn't think he'd use it for himself. But it looks like he had other plans. I remember sitting there, kind of shocked, like I was just trying to keep up with everything the lawyer was saying. Turns out I was about to inherit a lot more than I expected. His house, his cars, a bunch of investments I didn't even know about, and a nice chunk of cash. The lawyer even handed me a check right there for some immediate expenses. It was a lot. I went from stressing about paying bills to suddenly being pretty well off. But here's the thing, I wasn't thinking about the money. I was just trying to wrap my head around the fact that my dad wouldn't be around much longer. That's all I could focus on, so after the lawyer left, I was sitting at the kitchen table just staring at this check. Felt unreal. Couldn't believe it. I kept thinking, my dad really trusted me with. I had to get it all done right by him. 2 weeks later, my dad passed away. I hadn't even had a chance to process it when Lisa showed up. I have no idea how she found out about the money. Maybe she had a sixth sense for cash. It didn't take her long to come knocking at my door. Of course, she didn't even bother with any kind of small talk. She didn't even knock. She just pushed her way inside like she still owned the place. She sat down on the couch, crossed her legs, and looked at me like she was about to give me a lecture. "I heard about your dad," she said in this fake, concerned voice that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. But before I could even respond, she dropped the real bomb. I wasn't expecting what came next. She said, "I think it's only fair that you give me half of the money." It seemed like she was entitled to a share of the money, given that we were married for years. I just stared at her, not even sure if I heard her right. She was acting like she had a claim to money that didn't even exist when we were married. "You must be joking," I finally said, trying not to laugh. "That money has nothing to do with you. It's my dad's, and now it's mine. You're not getting a cent." But Lisa wasn't about to take no for an answer. She got this smug look on her face and leaned back on the couch, crossing her arms. "Ben, you don't understand," she said, like she was talking to a child. "If you don't give me what's fair, I'll take you to court, and trust me, I'll win." At that point, I was done. I stood up and told her to leave. I wasn't going to let her sit there and act like she had any power over me. We were done, and that meant she had no say in my life anymore. But she just stayed sitting there, staring at me with that same smug expression. "I'll be back," she said, standing up and walking towards the door. "When I come back, I expect you to have my half ready." or you'll regret it." She slammed the door on her way out, leaving me standing there stunned. I knew Lisa was greedy, but I didn't think she'd stoop this low. I should have known better after she left. I tried to calm myself down, but it wasn't easy. My head was spinning. I knew she was serious about coming after the money, and I didn't think she'd play fair. She was going to do whatever it took to get what she wanted, and that meant I needed to be. The next few days were quiet, but I had a feeling something was coming. Sure enough, a week later, I started getting harassed. It started with random phone calls from unknown numbers, and then people hanging up as soon as I answered. Things escalated. One night, I came home and found a brick had been thrown through my front window. I called the cops, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't have any proof it was Lisa or her family, but I knew. I was sure they were behind it, and that was just the beginning. A few days after the brick incident, I came home late from work and noticed something strange. There were muddy footprints leading up to my front door. I hadn't been home all day, and I definitely didn't leave those tracks. I unlocked the door and walked inside. My heart was pounding. The house was a mess. Someone had broken in, gone through my things, and trashed the place. The worst part was that whoever it was didn't take anything. It wasn't a robbery. I knew it was Lisa and her family trying to scare me and make me give in, but I wasn't going to let them win. I filed another police report, but again, nothing came of it. At this point, I knew I had to be on high alert. Lisa wasn't just going to walk away quietly. She wanted that money, and she'd do whatever it took to get it, even if it meant making my life a living hell. Things had been getting real. It's been pretty rough since Lisa found out about my inheritance. I've had this constant feeling in my stomach, waiting for the next thing she or her crazy family would do. It's like living in a nightmare that just won't end. One night, I was exhausted from the long day just doing regular stuff. Picking up the kids from school, working, trying to act like everything was normal. But in the back of my mind, I knew things weren't right. I'd already replaced the window they smashed, and I thought maybe they'd ease up. I was up for a bit, but I was wrong. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I was dead asleep. I woke up to this loud banging sound. At first, I thought it was something outside, maybe the wind knocking something over. But then I heard it again, louder. This time, it was coming from the front door. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and went downstairs. Whoever it was, they weren't just knocking. They were slamming their fists against the door like they were trying to break it down. I looked through the window and saw it was Lisa's brother, Jerome. He's always been a bit intense, and he's always been way too protective of Lisa, even when she's wrong. I knew letting him in wasn't an option, but before I could even think of what to do, he started shouting through the door. "Ben, open the damn door. We know you're in there. Don't make me break this thing down." I could tell he was, I'm not just here for a friendly chat. He was acting like he was going to cause some damage. I could feel the panic building up, but I tried to stay calm. I wasn't about to let this guy intimidate me in my own home. "Get out of here, Jerome. You're not coming in." I shouted through the door, hoping he'd just leave. But of course, that didn't work. Instead of leaving, I heard the sound of glass shattering. Jerome had picked up a chair and smashed it through the living room window. One of my patio chairs went through the living room window. It was like everything happened in slow motion. Then the glass exploded everywhere, and I heard footsteps as he climbed through the broken window into my house. I had no choice but to run to the kitchen and grab the biggest knife I could find. I stood there ready for whatever was about to happen. I wasn't trying to be a hero, but there was no way I was going to let him hurt me or my kids. Thankfully, they were still asleep upstairs, but I really didn't want them to come downstairs and see their uncle tearing up the house. Jerome stormed into the kitchen, his face red and his eyes wild. He looked at the knife in my hand and just smirked. "What are you going to stab me, Ben? You don't have it in you." He stepped closer, but I held my ground, gripping the knife tighter. "Get out, Jerome. I'm warning you." He just laughed and shoved me, sighed like I was nothing. "You're going to give Lisa what she deserves, or I'll make sure you regret it." That's when I snapped. I'd been holding in the stress, the fear, and the anger, and it all came rushing out at once. I lunged at Jerome, knocking him off balance and slamming him into the fridge. He didn't see it coming. We struggled for a few seconds, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. But I put him in a headlock and pushed him towards the door. "Get out," I said, half expecting him to fight back harder. But he seemed to realize I wasn't messing around anymore. He stumbled through the door, cursing me out as he went, but he didn't try to come back inside. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a second, just trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd never been in a situation like that before, where I'd actually had to fight someone in my own home. It was terrifying, but at the same time, I felt a weird sense of relief. I'd finally stood up to Jerome, and I wasn't backing down anymore. But as soon as I started to calm down, the reality hit me. This wasn't over. If Jerome was willing to break into my house, what was next? I had to protect my kids, and I had to make sure this never happened again. The first thing I did was call. I'd never been in a situation like that before where I'd actually had to fight someone in my own home. It was terrifying, but at the same time, I felt this weird sense of relief. I'd finally stood up to Jerome, and I wasn't backing down anymore. But as soon as I started to calm down, the reality hit me. This wasn't over. If Jerome was willing to break into my house, what was next? I had to protect my kids, and I had to make sure this never happened again. The first thing I did was call the cops. The cops came out pretty fast, took my statement, and I told them everything, the brick, the threats, Jerome breaking in. It all came pouring out. The officer looked at me like he'd seen this kind of thing before and nodded along as I talked. He said, "Weck, you might want to think about getting a restraining order." I couldn't believe it had come to that, but I knew he was right. These people were unhinged, and there was no telling what they'd do next. I needed to do everything I could to keep them away from me and my kids. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I went straight to the courthouse and filed for a restraining order. I also got some security cameras installed around the house. I wasn't about to let these people catch me off guard again. Every little sound after that had me jumping, but at least I felt like I had a little more control for a few days. Things were quiet. I hadn't heard from them. I thought maybe the restraining order scared them off, but then I got a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer. Lisa was officially taking me to court. She was suing me for half of my dad's inheritance. She was claiming that, as my ex-wife, she was entitled to it. Couldn't believe it. This woman had no shame. She was really trying to get her hands on money that had nothing to do with her. I felt sick to my stomach, but at the same time, I was ready for the fight. If she thought she was going to bully me into giving her what she wanted, she had another thing coming. I called my lawyer and started preparing. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't about to let her win. I had already lost enough. My dad, my peace, my sense of safety. The one thing I wasn't going to lose was my dignity. The court date was set for a few weeks later. As the day got closer, I could feel the tension building. Lisa wasn't backing down, and her family was still lurking in the shadows waiting for their chance to strike. But I was ready this time. I wasn't afraid anymore. This was my fight now, and I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. I thought things were finally calming down after filing for the restraining order, dealing with the police, and preparing for the court case. I figured Lisa and her family had to get the message that I wasn't going to back down. I was wrong. I'd seriously underestimated just how far they were willing to go. It was about a week before the court date, and I decided to take a trip to the cemetery to visit my dad's grave. I hadn't been there since the funeral, and I felt like I needed some time to clear my head away from all the noise and chaos. The court stuff, the break-in, it was all wearing me down. Visiting my dad's resting place seemed like I decided to go to the cemetery to remind myself why I was fighting so hard to protect what he left me. I drove out to the cemetery in the afternoon. It was quiet and peaceful, even though it was one of those spots tucked away from the busy parts of town with old trees lining the paths and hardly anyone around. When I got to my dad's grave, though, something felt off right away. From a distance, I could see that something wasn't right with his tombstone. It didn't look the same as it did when I got there. As I got closer, I realized why the tombstone was shattered and completely destroyed. There were chunks of stone scattered everywhere, and someone had spray painted on the ground right in front of the grave. The words were clear as day. The money is hers. Pay up or this keeps happening. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Who does that? Who disrespects the dead like that just to send some messed up message? I stood there staring at the ruins of my dad's tombstone, my hands shaking with anger. It wasn't just about the money anymore. They were going after my dad and his memory. That's when it really hit me. Lisa's family didn't care about boundaries or respect. They only cared about getting what they thought they were owed. For a second, I thought about just giving in and handing over the money to make it stop. But then I remembered my dad. He worked hard his whole life and saved every penny. He trusted me to do the right thing with it. He wouldn't want I wouldn't roll over for these people. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the scene. My hands were still trembling. Then I called the police again. I felt like I was on the phone with them every other day at this point. When the officer arrived, he looked almost as stunned as I was. He said, "Wow," shaking his head as he took in the sight. "I've seen vandalism, but this is different," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's personal." We walked around the grave and I showed him the spray paint on the ground, and the officer wrote in his notebook. He told me they'd increase patrols around the cemetery at night, but I wasn't sure they'd catch these people. They weren't leaving fingerprints or ID cards behind. I went to the cemetery office afterward and paid for a new tombstone. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. My dad deserved better than this, and I was going to make sure he had one. I wanted to make sure my dad had a proper resting place, no matter what these people did. On the drive home, I thought about how far Lisa and her family were going to take this. I couldn't stop thinking about them desecrating my dad's grave. Couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them see that they were getting to me. When I got home, the kids were still at school, so I had some time to think. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at my phone, debating whether to call Lisa. I knew it wouldn't do any good, but part of me wanted to scream at her to stop. I wanted to tell her she was disgusting, that she was vandalizing my dad's grave. I wanted to say she'd hit a new low. I wanted to tell her this wouldn't work. I wanted to say she wasn't getting a dime. I picked up my phone and debated whether to call Lisa. I knew it wouldn't do any good, but part of me wanted to scream at her to stop. But then again, that's probably exactly what she wanted. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me desperate enough to pay her off. Instead, I sent her a text. I kept it simple. "You're disgusting. Vandalizing my dad's grave. You've hit a new low. This won't work. You're not getting a dime." I didn't hear back, which I didn't really expect. I figured she was probably sitting with her family, plotting their next move and laughing about what they'd done. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got, but I knew I had to stay focused on the court case and make sure I had all my facts straight. So Lisa didn't have a chance in hell of winning. A few days passed, and things were quiet. No phone calls, no bricks, no creepy messages taped to my front door. It seemed like they were waiting for something, which made me even more nervous. The court date was coming up fast, and I knew they were gearing up for a final push to break me. The night before the court hearing, I could barely sleep. Every little noise in the house made me jump. I kept imagining Jerome smashing through another window or, worse, showing up at the cemetery again to destroy the new tombstone I'd ordered. Morning came and nothing happened. No more vandalism. No more threats. Just silence. When I walked into the courtroom the next day, Lisa was sitting with her lawyer. She didn't even look at me, but I could feel the tension radiating off her. This was it. We were finally going to settle this in front of a judge. As the hearing started, her lawyer tried to paint me as this greedy, selfish guy who was hiding my dad's money. He claimed that, since our divorce had been finalized long ago, Lisa was entitled to half of the inheritance. Before my dad passed away, my lawyer was ready. He pointed out that Lisa had no legal claim to the money. It was all left to me, and there was no provision in the divorce agreement that gave her any rights to it. The judge listened to both sides, nodding every once in a while, but his expression never changed. Then it was over. The judge ruled in my favor. Lisa wasn't getting anything. I could see the anger in her eyes as the judge delivered his decision. She stood up, glaring at me. From across the room, I thought she might explode right there in the courtroom, but she just turned and stormed out. Her lawyer trailed behind her. I won the case, but I knew this wasn't the end. Lisa wasn't the type to give up so easily. She'd be back, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. So I won in court. You'd think that would be the end of it. I mean, the judge ruled that Lisa wasn't getting a dime. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I was wrong. Even with the legal win, Lisa and her family weren't done making my life hell. The first sign that things weren't over came just a couple days after the court ruling. I'd just gotten home from work and the kids were with their mom for the weekend. It was one of those rare moments where the house was quiet and I could actually sit. I made myself a coffee, sat down on the couch, and finally started to relax. That lasted about 7 p.m. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was spam, but when I opened it, I saw that it said, "You may have won in court, but this isn't over. You'll pay one way or another." I knew right away it was from Lisa or one of her family members. It was from Lisa or one of her family members. I could feel the anger boiling up again, but I tried to push it down. It was just another empty threat. They were mad they lost in court and were trying to scare me. I told myself it was nothing, they couldn't touch me now. But deep down I knew better. The next couple of days were weird. I started noticing strange things around the house. Small stuff like things being moved around. I come home and the back gate would be wide open. The back gate was open, even though I always made sure to lock it. Then there were the knocks on the door, usually late at night, but when I went to check, no one was there. It was little things like that, just enough to make me feel on edge, but not enough to call the cops about. Then one night things escalated. It was around 3 a.m. and I woke up to this loud crashing sound. It was like someone was throwing rocks at my house. My heart was pounding as I jumped out of bed and looked out the window. Sure enough, there were a couple of figures standing in my front yard throwing bricks at my house. They didn't care that I might see them. They wanted me to see. They wanted me to know it was them. I grabbed my phone and called 911 as I ran downstairs. I wasn't thinking straight. I was just running on adrenaline. By the time I got to the front door, I saw them speed off in a black car. They didn't just break my windows. They spray painted the front of my house with the word "thief" in giant red letters. When the cops finally showed up, I felt completely drained. I was pissed off, but mostly I was tired. Tired of the threats, the damage, and the constant harassment. The officers took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. They told me to install more security cameras and file for another restraining order. Felt like the usual stuff, but none of it was enough. That's when I realized Lisa and her family were relentless. I tried to play by the rules and get restraining orders through the courts, but it wasn't working. They didn't care about laws or boundaries. They were going to keep coming at me until I gave them what they wanted or pushed me to the edge. The next morning, I went out to clean up the mess. There were pieces of brick scattered all over the front yard, and the spray paint was still glaring at me. The front wall was gone. It was almost funny at this point, considering they were the ones trying to steal from me as I was cleaning up. My neighbor, Mr. Rare, came over. He's this old guy, probably in his late 70s, and he's always been friendly with me. We didn't talk much, but he'd wave when I was out mowing the lawn or say hi if we ran into each other at the grocery store. He looked at the damage and shook his head. "It's a shame," he said. "I saw them doing it last night, but I didn't want to get involved." I sighed, rubbing my forehead. "Yeah, I don't blame you. This whole thing's been a nightmare." Mr. Rare nodded, then paused, like he was thinking about something. "You know, Ben," he said slowly, "I've got an old friend in town who used to be a private investigator. He might be able to help you look into these people and see if there's anything you can use against them." At first, I wasn't sure. Hiring a PI seemed like something out of a crime show, not real life. But at that point, I was desperate. I needed to do something, so I told Mr. Rare I'd think about it. The next day, I gave his friend a call. The PI was a guy named Mike. He wasn't what I expected, just a regular-looking guy, not the trench coat-wearing type you see in the movies. We sat down and I told him everything. The harassment, the court case, the vandalism. I didn't leave anything out. Mike listened quietly, nodding as I talked. When I was done, he said, "Sounds like these people won't stop until they're either scared off or locked up." Let's see what we can dig up on them over the next week. Mike did his thing. He followed Lisa's family, looked into their backgrounds, and even did some digging into their finances. What he found wasn't shocking. Turns out, Lisa's family was deep in debt. They were desperate for a way out, and the inheritance was their ticket. Mike found some interesting stuff, though. There was a record of some shady dealings that Lee's brother Jerome had been involved in. It wasn't concrete, but it was enough to get the police more interested. I went to the police again, armed with Mike's info. This time, they took it seriously. They started investigating Jerome and the rest of the family more closely. Within a few weeks, they found enough evidence to charge him with multiple crimes, including vandalism, harassment, and even fraud. When Jerome was arrested, everything changed. The harassment stopped, the bricks, the phone calls, the threats. It all just disappeared. Lisa and her family went quiet. I guess they finally realized they were in too deep. It wasn't the ending I expected, but it was the one I got after Jerome was taken down. Lisa stopped coming after me. She didn't have the backup anymore, and I think she knew she was out of options for the first time in months. I felt like I could breathe again.